What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Dennis Camp's Ultimates. And yeah, man, the best comic coming out of Marvel right now. So, this deals with the introduction of John Walker and another secret character, and I'm curious to see if you guys figure it out, although we do find out at the end. So, what this does is this picks up with the group called the Red Skulls. Now, this is Dennis Camp drawing very heavily from Earth X. And I'll explain what that means here in a minute, but we're given a kind of direct explanation of what the Red Skulls are about. And one of the things that it says is that it is an extreme conservative movement that appropriated the tactics and iconography of 1970s NYC officer turned vigilante Frank Castle. And it makes reference to Punisher and then Summer of Frank. Now, as far as I'm aware, there's no indication that Frank Castle is currently operating within this new Ultimate Universe in Marvel Comics. And the fact that it makes reference to Punisher and the Summer of Frank while also saying that it took place in the 70s, basically, Frank Castle is like David Berkowitz in this particular Ultimate Universe. Now, David Berkowitz, you guys have heard of him before, the Son of Sam, right? The Son of Sam killers in 1977. He killed like 6 people in the city of New York. There was a huge manhunt, and there's a really good movie by Spike Lee called Summer of Sam that details a lot of that stuff. But what it also tells us is that the Red Skulls are classified as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and that precise ideology is inconsistent and contradictory. The group is primarily identity driven, ostensibly anti-establishment, but mostly focuses on terrorizing the weak and the vulnerable, right? So they want to bring down the system, and they do that by attacking people who are essentially innocent. And it says Castletown is the permanent home to approximately 1,500 men, women, and children, as well as the current Grand Skull, leader of the National Red Skull movement. So, in effect, the Red Skulls are just the Klan. That's really all they are here, right? And so, because of that, one of the things that's realized here by Captain America and Wasp and Giant Man and Hawkeye and Jim Hammond, right, the original Human Torch here in this particular story, one, because he was the first who was created, and because two, with the origin story of Reed and Doctor Doom, as those of you guys know from the Ultimates line, everybody except for Reed and the Fantastic Four is dead. So, right, in this instance, they're like, okay, this is going to have to be a stealth mission. Now, as far as how it ties into the idea of Earth X, which we still need to cover Universe X and Paradise X, that as those of you guys who have read that story or saw our videos on it know, you had a Red Skull in Earth X, but it was actually a guy who had mind control powers and was slowly seizing control of the United States using his mind control and creating like a whole army. He was astronomically powerful. And in fact, he was, I think, the only person with mental powers who existed on Earth X at that point in time because everybody else had been killed. But it's kind of bringing that element in to a degree. But the other part of this is the group is somewhat joined by Tony Stark. Now, those of you guys who, again, have been following the Ultimates, and there's a playlist if you guys need to get caught up, Tony Stark made the poor, unfortunate decision of fighting the Incredible Hulk, and the Incredible Hulk broke him in half. And so Tony Stark has been recovering. Literally, surgery is being done on his back to restore his ability to walk. So that's the benefit of technology and Doctor Doom's capabilities and whatnot. So that's why he's not out there in the field. But again, we'll talk about his involvement because he plays a pretty significant role as you get towards the end of the story. Instead, what ends up going on here is we get this kind of internal monologue from Jim Hammond. Being a cyborg, he's able to kind of calculate probabilities, different things along those lines. What he says is that this mission has to rule out a frontal assault for the same reason that Stain and Stark never stormed any of the castles of the Red Skulls, which seems to indicate they've been around for quite some time. And he says for the same reason that the Council, the Illuminati, will not touch them. They brought their kids. The Ultimates don't attack kids. Whatever they say about us in the news, we cannot take the risk. So it's a stealth mission. And when you're talking about a group like this, it's actually a very smart strategy. It's terrible. It's a horrible thing to do. But the Achilles heel of superheroes are innocent bystanders. So if you're villains out there and you're depraved enough, you can use innocent bystanders to your advantage in order to overcome the superheroes. And that's kind of what happens here to a degree. The issue is, and what we're going to see is that the Red Skulls are largely just a bunch of crazy guys, right? They don't really know what they're doing. They're just people who identify with a particular political ideology, and some dude says, hey, do you guys all believe this and do you hate the system? Come hang out here. And they did. right? I mean, these guys get crushed quite readily. The first person to go in, of course, is Captain America, who knocks a couple of these guys out. And then in turn, you have Wasp and you have Hank Pym who step in. Now, one of the things to keep in mind here is that Hank Pym in this new Ultimate Universe is very similar to his character in the main Marvel Universe, as well as Wasp, Janet Van Dyne. Between the two of them, Wasp was always the more confident. She was always the one that really seemed to have it together, especially after she divorced Hank and left and then struck out into the world and started doing her own thing. Marvel wrote that story at a time when women were kind of achieving higher levels of independence, and they rolled that over into her character and made her a lot more confident. Hank Pym, on the other hand, since his introduction in Marvel Comics, has always been the guy who just couldn't get it together. Hank Pym could not get his life together if it was a puzzle made out of three pieces. Like, he's always been struggling with a personal identity. He never knew who he was. It was always one of these things that he dealt with, right? Crises of confidence, which made for some pretty compelling storytelling back in the day. But honestly, it was just kind of his Achilles heel. And that's what went on here. That, as it's explained by Jim Hammond, right? He says Giant Man and Wasp are perfect for this sort of operation on paper. Pym particles give them both the ability to shrink as well as grow. Wasp is natural, smart but not neurotic, confident but not cocky. It's like she's been at this for years, but her partner Giant Man is a whole other story. He's got a big heart, but it's just not in his kind of work. He's always second guessing himself, hesitating when he shouldn't, and it's going to get him killed one day, probably soon. Now, something to notice here is a very cavalier statement. Yeah, he's probably going to die. Right? You don't really see that normally when it comes to like the Avengers or any of the superhero teams in the main Marvel universe. That if it comes down to a situation where a member of their team seems so incapable of effectively performing their duties that they may get themselves or someone else killed, Captain America will kick them off the team. He'll be like, "Look, man, you're cool, and we can definitely get drinks sometime, but you're clearly the weakest link. You're going to get yourself or somebody else killed. You got to go," right? And he really won't pick any bones about it, right? And then, of course, Jim Hammond comments on Hawkeye and says Hawkeye never hesitates. The trick is making sure they're pointed in the right direction. The quiver fabricates noise-canceling knockout arrows. The men don't even whisper as they fall. And so again, like, these things are taken to them quite readily. And one of the things that Captain America comments on is the fact that they received information that connects this organization to hand. And one of the things that happens is he's like, it's all just one giant fight, Tony. And Tony's like, actually, no, it's thousands of fights. Because one of the things that Tony's looking at is a screen with all these various conflicts that are taking place at the same time around the Ultimate Universe. Reading the stories in isolation, it is easy to forget that it's all happening concurrently. And so in this instance, right, you have everything going on with Peter Parker and, well, really Harry Osborn, who was just killed in the most recent issue, which was nuts. I agree with you guys, though, after thinking about it, it's definitely a ruse for Mysterio. You've got like the Ultimate X-Men line, which, with Peach Momoko may or may not be your thing. You've got the Winter Soldier, right? Like James Hudson, Wolverine, who's out there in Eastern Europe doing his thing. It's all these small little pieces and small little skirmishes all across the board. But at the end of the day, we still don't know why the Ultimates are here. Like, surely they have more important things to do than to just take out some faction of a hate group somewhere. Do they need to be dealt with? I mean, sure. But in the hierarchy of things that matter, this is pretty low on the list. And so what ends up happening is that because Tony Stark can't really operate as an effective member of the team, and really seems more of a distraction than anything else, Captain America cuts off his connection to him from a communication standpoint. And then at that point, they go after basically the main castle of the Red Skulls. And when they get in there, they just blitz all these guys, right? Take all these guys out. Then they get into the room, which is the reason for their mission in the first place, to find Namor the Submariner, only to find out this guy's basically just like attached to a wall. He's strung up like some kind of taxidermied object, and like he's dead. And they're just kind of like, wow, right? And then at that point, you have this guy who just says, the gang's all here. It's an invaders reunion, which is actually a great reference, because those of you guys who are familiar with the history of Marvel Comics, the invaders is the name that was used by Namor, Jim Hammond, Captain America, and Bucky Barnes when they fought against the Axis powers during World War II. And so he's like, we were well prepared for the invaders. So we finally get to see what Ultimate Red Skull looks like. But what we're told here by Jim Hammond with his analysis is he's like, at least 5 different men have held the position of Grand Skull. 4 died violently. The civilian identity of the current Grand Skull is unknown to the public, and perhaps even the larger organization itself. And that's where they're just kind of like, it's really like this is actually Namor the Submariner. It's not a ruse, it's not a trick. This is actually him. And that's where the Grand Skull is just like, so you weren't really supposed to know about him, at least not yet. Now, there are attempts made by Jim Hammond to like recognize his voice, different things like that, but he can't build any measure of an identity over how this guy is talking because of just how his voice is altered with different effects and things like that. And so what ends up happening is Jim Hammond asks the question, like, did you kill this guy? Right? And that's where you get this really cool and interesting story here, where the Grand Skull, or Red Skull, whatever you want to call him, he says, the certificate of authenticity says his death was a political matter, an underwater coup at some point. The Mad King was overthrown according to Atlantean custom and executed according to Atlantean law, as were his many wives, allies, and heirs. But the body became a holy site. Religion sprung up around it like seaweed, oppressed Atlanteans making pilgrimages and problems. The new regime down there did not like it, so they exiled their former king after they killed him, which has to be some kind of a first. It doesn't decay. They say, or at least the worshippers say, it's just his super dense tissue. They claim the ocean's microorganisms refuse to eat the body, that even dead, every living thing down there recognizes its rightful king. And then at that point, it's almost kind of like a criticism of ideologies, right? He says, the things people hold on to, it wasn't my idea to mount him, by the way. That was the last guy, a real collector, very into big game. But it turns out the corpse is a killer recruitment tool. The boys can't get enough of it. They practically piss themselves. And he's like, there's some kind of a lesson in there somewhere about symbols and their context. Down there, he's a miracle. Up here, he's a joke. The fish that never rots. Now, what we don't know here, right? What we don't know about all this is the basically coup and execution of Namor the Submariner a product of the Maker? Because remember, the Maker went back and started shifting all these things in this universe, changing it around, distorting it, twisting it, and making it a pretty terrible place. We don't know if this was a part of it or not. Seemingly it was, at least not that I recall. So I'm curious to see if that was the case. But at the end of the day, Captain America's like, this is what we trained for, guys, right? We came here to get Namor. Namor's not here. Clear the room. And they take everybody out. And I mean, when they take everybody out, I mean, like, they kill people. Right? The Ultimates do not care. I mean, they're pretty brutal. They care, right? But like, these are bad guys. Bad guys get snuffed out. Like the Human Torch is like torching these guys, like literally burning them. And so at that point, Captain America catches up to the Grand Skull. And he's like, here's the thing, man. And the Grand Skull makes an interesting case here, right? He's like, wait a minute, right? He's like, here's the thing. You could learn a lot from us, right? How we operate. I mean, we both preach violent revolution against the world government, but we've been at this a lot longer than you have. And that's a true statement. That is an accurate statement, right? It's easy to ignore that statement and say, no. Good guys versus bad guys, yada, yada, yada. No. Captain America and the Ultimates are working to bring down the Illuminati, the ones who run everything behind the scenes, by any means necessary. Red Skull and them are looking to do the exact same thing. They both have different means of doing it, but the result, the end goal, is still the exact same. So there is a credible argument to make there that the difference between Captain America and the Grand Skull isn't that different. But Captain America immediately claps back and is like, it's all the difference in the world. You're racist thugs and murderers. We're nothing like you. We tear down world governments using positive strategies. You tear down world governments using negative strategies, right? So again, the difference is really more just kind of indiscriminate, right? Just creating an arbitrary line in the sand to differentiate between Captain America and the Red Skull. And so what the Skull says is like, he's like, you're right about that, right? We've got more money, better branding, and a much larger membership. We give them an enemy, a symbol. We give them something to believe in and something to die for. What do you give them? And he's like, here's one of our true believers now. His name is John Walker. John's been a devoted follower of Red Skull content for years, ever since he was a boy. 16 months ago, he came to me with a metal box, a message from Tony Stark, and a vial of super soldier serum, asking me what to do. And do you know what I told him to do with it? I told him to kick their heads in. And so ultimately, John took the super soldier serum. Now, here's the important thing about all this. This is a direct result of Tony Stark's actions. If you guys recall, when it came to Ultimate Invasion, Jonathan Hickman writing the 4-issue miniseries that set all this in motion in the first place. That was the story that detailed everything the maker did to change this universe in an effort to turn it into the original Ultimate Universe, albeit one under his total control. And that when Howard Stark was killed as Iron Man, and then Tony Stark adopted the name Iron Lad, and then working alongside Doctor Doom, took off into the future, that what Tony Stark did is he realized and learned how the universe was supposed to unfold. He didn't know every single change the maker made, but he understood enough changes to be able to try to correct them. So we started basically creating these gift boxes, for lack of a better word. So we showed up to Spider-Man and presented him with a Picotech suit because the radioactive spider was killed by the maker. There was no way to go back and fix that. And that's how Spider-Man gained the Venom symbiote in the Ultimate Universe, right? He went and thawed out Captain America, so on and so forth. They rescued Thor, different things along those lines. And so this is one of those instances where seemingly because John Walker in the main Marvel Universe does become U.S. agent when he's appointed by the Commission on Superhuman Activities and Valerie Cooper, at least, back in Marvel Comics anyway, that he does take the super soldier serum, but ultimately he's ousted. And so during that moment, it was Tony Stark trying to rectify the past. Here's the funny thing about this. John Walker is a moron because John Walker literally comes walking towards them. No pun intended. He takes one step. Jim Hammond makes it his last one. He torches this dude's head on the spot. And that's the end of John Walker. And literally Grand Skull is just like, huh, okay. All right, so that's how things are. And so it's just like, the chips are down, man. The game is over. The jig is up. And so at that point, Captain America's like, you are not the Red Skull. I killed Johann Schmidt over 75 years ago. Take that thing off and give this charade up because it's curtains. You're done. But here's a very important thing, because what the Grand Skull does, right, with the helmet being attacked and with seemingly the voice modulator being ruined, or at the very least being turned off, by the Grand Skull, Tony Stark chimes in and he says, this is Tony Stark to Grand Skull. I'm transmitting directly to your skull. In the last 20 minutes, I've scrubbed all known Red Skull content from the internet, crashed all related platforms, and drained all of your secret bank accounts. Yes, even that one. I needed something to focus on. And Grand Skull says, good gravy. It looks like you've got me. Captain America has done it again. But I'm like you now, Cap. I'm more than a man. I'm a symbol, and symbols don't die. They just come back different. It was good to see you, Steve. And then he teleports away. Right now, if any of you guys had any doubts on who Grand Skull may have been, surely you figured it out now. There's no way you couldn't. But we are told here in a second, because dude, as soon as that happened, I was just like, no way. No way. So what ends up going on here is, of course, they give name of the Submariner, right, yada, yada. They send his body out to sea, whatever. So then you jump to this moment, this kind of epilogue, right, where you've got Jim Hammond, who's basically commenting on everything, right? And he's like, Jim Hammond, real-time report. Steve has not slept or spoken since the funeral. He just sits in his room with the light burning all night. As a result of my cognitive upgrade, I've gotten much better at reading human emotional cues. I now recognize that Steve is deeply troubled, as am I. But why? It's not just Namor. It was something the Grand Skull said, not the mind control distortion, but what it was hiding. And the voice suddenly just says, it was good to see you, Steve. And he's like, it was hiding something familiar. And so as he's analyzing it, it's like voice match. And he just keeps running the voice in his head over and over again, right? Voice match, 90% voice match found. And it's James Buchanan Barnes. And Captain America's like, Bucky? With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Bucky's here in the Ultimate Universe, man. And I am hyped. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.